So in terms of thinking about skills, there's two main skills that this session is designed to progress for you. One is your understanding of the poem, and the other is your ability to analyse the poem. So we're going to be doing a combination of the two things together. So we're just going to be taking a jolly through the poem, starting at the beginning. And just as I said with the previous poem, you should not overlook the importance of the title. And the title can be used as evidence. It is part of the poem and can therefore be used as a quotation, as evidence in the Scottish Literature part of the exam. So the title obviously of this poem is War Photographer. And whenever we look at the title, the question we must ask is what is the purpose, what is the function of the title? And in this case, the purpose of the title is to identify the subject or focus of the poem. In essence, it identifies the occupation of the main character in our poem. And we can assume that as they are being defined by that occupation, that it's obviously fundamental and important part of the poem. So if we start with the opening line, in his dark room, clearly that reinforces our understanding of the occupation of our main character, which is that they are a photographer. Because we know that a dark room is a place in which people develop photographs. What's also important about the opening line to this poem is it also introduces the narrative perspective, which in this case is a third person. And once we've identified the perspective that's being used, your next job is to try and identify the narrative voice that you hear. Now, when you're identifying narrative voice, that can mean one of two things. It can mean, first of all, being able to actually give a name to the person's voice that we hear. Or it can mean being able to define that narrative voice by a particular emotion or characteristic or aspect of their personality. In this case, we cannot give a name to the narrative voice because what we have is a third-person anonymous narrator. But we can define them from a particular aspect of the poem. And what we can say about this narrative voice, and I would argue is the main point of the poem, it is the climax that the poem is working to, is the condemnation that we see at the end. So the narrative voice is condemnatory. And if we condemn something, we judge it to say that it is wrong and that it is bad. And that's the point that this poem is working towards. A condemnation of two circumstances. One, those people who choose to be ignorant of the horrors in war-torn countries, and those who choose to forget or respond with inaction to the terror in war-torn countries. And that's where the condemnation is. So suppose you could say that there's three sets of people being condemned. The first one is the people who don't actually know what's going on. The second one is those who do know what's going on but choose to forget it as quickly as possible. And the third group is those who do know what is going on and recognise it and acknowledge it, but choose to do nothing about it. And that's where the condemnation is. Now, who is this you that I'm referring to? Well, it's all of us. As representations of society, the you that's referred to in this poem is in essence the reader, it is the audience, it is us. What your job is, in terms of analysing this poem from the perspective of the exam, is not to personalise that and turn it into some kind of rant about how you're not one of these people who ignores what's going on in war-torn countries and are actually an activist or something along those lines. Don't personalise it. The you that's being referred to is a representation of society. And we, as members of that society, are part of that you. Okay, so you have to depersonalise it in your analysis. So we've identified that the focus, the subject of this poem is going to be this war photographer. We have the setting, where he's located, which is in his dark room. And then we have some very interesting stuff with word choice in the use of the word finally. And that has two sets of connotations. If you say finally, it can suggest that this is a welcome state, something that they have been longing for, something they have been needing, a requirement. But equally, it can mark the sense that this person has been in company for quite a substantial period of time. I think in terms of better analysis, seeing it as a welcome state, something that's actually been needed, I think is more relevant and appropriate in this context. And certainly as we read the poem and discover more about our war photographer, we can understand why he would have that need to be alone. The narrator then follows it up with brilliant piece of imagery, actually, in the spools of suffering. And the brilliance of that image actually goes beyond imagery and actually includes the use of sound. So we have imagery and sibilance coming together with the spools of suffering. So that potentially could give you two pieces of analysis if a question was to direct you towards that particular line. First would obviously be the metaphor on spools of suffering. Now this may be the point where you ask yourself the question, if the spools are being described as suffering, is that not an example of personification? And having given that some careful thought and consideration, I think it would be unfair to say that animals do not experience suffering. And for that reason, I've chosen to refer to it as a metaphor. I don't think there's necessarily a right or a wrong answer to that, but you can see there where you start to get a blurring between metaphors and personification. But I think the more accurate term here would be to refer to it as a metaphor. The content of the spools, which is literally the photographs, is being compared to something that suffers, which suggests some form of pain. And because we know from the title of the poem that these photographs have been taken by a war photographer, we have a good expectation of the content of those pictures, and therefore we can understand the relationship between the photographs and pain. The effect is to emphasise the extent of the suffering experienced by people in war-torn countries. The suffering is to such an extent that it is actually reflected through the photographs. It permeates them. And that's all about shocking you with a realisation of the extent of pain. And that's the starting part of the process to help you learn the lesson that the poem is trying to teach you, is by establishing the importance, the significance of this at the beginning. It's reinforced beautifully by the sibilance, where we have a repetition on this sound, which adds even greater depth to our understanding of that particular image. Because as we know, very often sibilance is used to allude to the serpentile sound that we associate with the snake, which is in turn an allusion to the biblical story in the Garden of Eden, and therefore having connotations of evil. So we've got these evil pictures. They're evil because they've got people in them that are suffering, and they're set out in ordered rows. And that description of the way in which the spools have been placed, again, it's about, it's another allusion in the sense that it's referencing an image that we may well be familiar with, which is this idea of gravestones, crosses, which are also set out in ordered rows. And the idea, by setting them out like that, is this suggestion of death, so that we understand that these photographs don't just contain human suffering, but there's also a suggestion in the way that they've been laid out that they actually represent death.